All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to start diving into coding tutorials for our loops, but this one specifically is just going to cover for loops, and I will do a separate one for our while and our do while. So let's go ahead and get started. I basically have already set up a starter file for us to work with, so I named it for loops.java. And basically, we're going to do all of our for loop examples within this class. So, of course, going forward, our first thing is always making sure that we have our main class. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. All right. All right. So we have that set up, and now we're ready to go. So first, we basically need to start by creating a simple example of a for loop. So example 1. Now when you create a for loop, you start it off by stating a lowercase 4, just like this. If you put a capital, you're going to run into problems. So make sure it's always lowercase. Once you do that, you create the parentheses and then you place the curly braces like that. Now it's going to give us an error because we haven't set up those three main components that we covered: initialization, the condition, and the update, but we will get there. So I'm just making sure I have all of my braces in order. So I'll say end of for loop 1 here so we know. And then this is the end of main, and this is the end of class. So now that we're starting to work with a lot of coding structures that have curly braces in it, sometimes your braces could get lost or it's hard for you to truly identify what brace matches with what. So that's just a little trick I personally use to stay organized and make sure that I'm not deleting anything that I'm not supposed to, and or I have enough braces for everything on the screen. So now that we have that created, we have our basic structure, but now we need to put in our information. So the first portion we need to do is our initialization, which is creating our loop counter or variable that we will be using. So how do we do that? The first part is always going to be int, okay? Because basically we're stating that this is our number, this is our loop counter that we'll be working with. So obviously it's going to be an int. Now, the next portion is a variable. As you all know, when you're creating your variables, that you have to give it a variable name after the data type. In this case, you don't necessarily want to give it a full name. And many times in a loop, you'll see people use just one letter. Generally, they'll use I to stand for iterator or the initializer. So many times people just use int I and then they start from there. So we'll say int I is going to equal to some value. What value exactly is totally up to you, but in this case, we'll start with 0. So now we have our initialization done. We have our loop counter initialization that's been completed. So for the rest of the condition that we are going to be placing into our parentheses for our for loop, we will be using this variable now. So now that it's created, we have to use that in a condition. So we would say I and then provide a condition. So let's say I is less than or equal to 10. All right. So that's a condition. So basically, this condition is saying to us, hey, this is my loop counter. I'm going to start it at 0. And it's also saying as long as our variable I is less than or equal to 10, then we want to run this loop. Now, for our value to change for our I, we have to have a increment or an update. Now, by default, if you want to add one, it is plus plus, and if you want to subtract one, it's minus minus. So that would be like this. Add 1. So if you want to add 1, you can do a plus plus. If you want to, I'll do it on the same line actually. If you want to subtract 1, you would do minus minus. Okay? So here what we're going to do is use our variable, and then we're going to say plus plus. And that is basically a standard construction of a for loop. Currently, we don't have anything in the for loop. So if we were to run this, nothing's going to happen because we did not place anything inside of this body here. It's basically empty. This is where you would place something into your for loop to run. So for this example, we'll just put a print statement. Print, oops, can't type. Print line. And we're going to just say iteration. And we're going to add our variable, which again is like our loop counter, to that. So basically what this is saying is every time the loop runs, we want to print out the value of I. And that way you can kind of see how your loops are working and how they run. So let's go ahead and test this out. And as you see here, we have an output. And it pretty much starts us at the value of 0. And that is the same value we gave it up here in our for loop. You see we said I is equal to 0. And then we have this condition. So each time the loop runs, it will check this value. So the very first time we did it, our value was 0. So if 0 is less than or equal to 10, then we want to run the loop. So in that case, it did. Now, once it ran the loop, it comes back up to the updater and changes the value of I. So now the next time I runs, I is now 1. And then it checks it again. Is 1 less than or equal to 10? Yes, it runs your loop. It comes back to your update. It changes the value. So that is the repetition that comes into play. It's constantly checking the value of I until the condition becomes false. In our case, you see our loop pretty much ran until it hit 10. Once it hit 10, it printed it out to us. We see it. It increased it to 11. Once the value of I reached 11, basically our loop could no longer run because 11 is greater than 10. So that means our condition in our loop, which was I is less than or equal to 10, is no longer true. So our loop could no longer run. And that is how our loop ended, because our condition finally became true. Now, in the case that we had swapped this, for example, you see we have this working fine. So let's see what happens if we said I is greater than or equal to 10. So we'll go ahead and test this out. Run that. And then you see here, nothing happens. Again, because our I started off as 0, so clearly it's never going to run. However, if we were to change this to, let's say 20, 20, and then we run this file, then you should see a different result. And you see now it is running and running and running and running, and it's pretty much not stopping. So I'm going to have to manually stop it here. And that's what I've done here. But if you take a look, we're basically saying our counter or our initialization value is worth 20. And if we say if I is greater than or equal to 10, then we want to run the loop, and then we continuously are adding or making that value of 20 greater, then that basically means there is no way for our condition to stop. And that is how we get an infinite loop. Hence the fact you see that we have this large output of numbers And in the matter of seconds, this is how fast that loop ran. And that is an infinite loop because I manually had to stop it. And as you see, I'm scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. You see how much information comes out. That is why you want to make sure that your condition always ends to avoid that infinite loop. So, yes, your value here can be whatever you need it to be. Generally, most people start off at 0, or if you want to start counting from 1, you could put 1. But that's just depending on how you're trying to use your for loop and what you're using it for. So for those purposes, I'm going to go ahead and just change it back, and we'll put it back to its normal original format. But that was just to kind of show you the idea of why paying attention to your conditions and your initialization variables are important. All right, so far you pretty much have seen how a loop runs, and that's just a basic example of what a loop looks like, or at least a for loop, and how to run it. So now we'll go on to another example. And I'll go ahead and create our for loop, and we'll go ahead and do for int I. And just to show you, actually, we'll say int y equals 0. This is just to prove to you that it doesn't really matter what you name the variable as long as you remember what it is. We can say while y is less than or equal to, well, let's just say less than. So while I is less than, let's say equal to, and we're going to leave that blank. And I'm going to do the y plus plus. Now, I know there's an error. That's because I haven't truly finished off my for loop, because I'm going to show you something else that's kind of a good trick. All right. So in this example, we're going to be working with our sequences. So working with a string. So to do this, we need to create a variable. So we'll say string word equals programming. All right. So now we have this word that we can work with. And let's say we want to print each character in the word. All right. So what we can do here is, now that you have a variable, what you could do is say the variable name and then give it that length method like that. And basically this is going to say for, this value starting at 0, as long as y is less than or equal to word.length, and remember word.length is another integer, then it's going to run some sort of code. So now what we can do is simply go inside of our for loop, and then let's just put a simple print statement. So system.out.print line, and then we're going to say y. Or better yet, let's see. We'll say some text just so we can separate the information that's being outputted. All right. So now we have two different for loops, and of course they're both going to run at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a simple print statement here to break it up. So system.out.print line, and then this is just a little trick I like to use when I don't want to see everything combining together, so it'll separate it in the output. So there you have it. So we'll run that and we'll test it out. And you see here's our little separator between our two loops. So our first loop goes from 0 to 10 and prints out whatever we state, which is what we wrote here. And then our second one is actually saying letter, and then it's basically saying how many letters we have here, right? So it's basically saying, okay, this is how many letters are in this word according to our count. Now, another thing to do is if we were to say, for example, system.out.print line, and we'll say the word has this many letters. We're going to go ahead and word dot length. And that way you can kind of see where the word dot length is being used and how it's being applied in our loop. So we'll go ahead and run that. And we'll run that. And keep in mind, this one is outside of the loop, so it's not going to print more than once. So that's why these comments at the end of your loop braces is important, because sometimes you could accidentally put a line into a loop that you don't need to run continuously or run repetitively. So you just have to make sure that you're outside of the loop when that happens. However, if you go ahead and take a look, it says that the word has this many letters. It says 11. And if you see in our loop iteration, it gave us 11. So technically, it does show us exactly what we need, and it is running it. But it's basically just giving us one by one what it is, right? So what I'm going to do here is we're going to comment this out. Another thing that we could do in this case is we have letter, but what we can do is they have those other methods that we can use for our strings. So if we say word dot char at y, okay? Now what's going on here is now we're going to say that we have a word, which is programming in this case. And in our loop, we basically want to run our loop based on the number of characters that that word has. So this will basically change the value according to whatever the variable is. So for the case of a person who's inputting some information, each word they input would have a different letter count. So therefore, this loop is now general to whatever word or word length there is. So in this case, we have programming. And basically, we're saying we want to run this loop for every character of our word that is being stored. And so in this print statement, what I'm saying is I want to access that variable, and then I want to get the actual character that is at that iteration position or the index. So this loop is now allowing me to access each index of that string through using a loop. So if you ever need to work with something data-wise with a loop, it allows you to go through a sequence and check each one individually. And that's basically what we'll be doing here. So go ahead and run. And you see here that we have programming coming out. Okay? So it's basically saying that what we have is these letters at these positions. And you could also technically print out the iteration as well if you were to keep that original line that we had there, where it was just letter plus y. But you don't necessarily have to do that. But for example, what we could do is say letter, and then let's go ahead and delete this part. We'll say letter, and then we will add another value here, y. And then we'll add another plus. Then I'll just add some space here for us. Or actually, let's just go ahead and add that there. All right. And we'll test that out here. So then you see it says letter 0, letter 1, letter 2, letter 3, letter 4, letter 5, letter 6, letter 7, letter 8, letter 9, letter 10, right? So that is because we're starting it at 0. But if we want to start it at the normal count, you can change this. It'll go to 1. And then it'll change it to say letter 1 is now P instead of letter 1 is 0. And that is another way you can go about it. So I'm just kind of showing you different ways that your loop can be applied. So now you see letter 1 is saying we're starting at R, which is technically the index of, your first index. Because remember, your index starts at 0. So this is where your for loops get tricky in keeping track of where you should start your initialization variable. How big do you want your range to go for your condition? And things get tricky. So it is a little hard to kind of understand the starting point and where you need to go for your code, but overall, you do have to kind of pay attention to these little minor pieces and see how they are put together. Now, prior to what I just did was I add a -1 because remember, your counter is technically not counting as we normally do. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4. It goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 for your indexes. So if you say the link, the original link that it is, it's basically going to give you an error because it never hits that full length. It doesn't have that many characters to give you because counting in programming starts at 0, while your loop counting would start at something else. And this truthfully can cause a problem in your range. So anytime you're working with sequences, to avoid any issues or errors that pop up, you have to make sure you do a word.length -1. That is showing you that we are outputting everything normally, there is no errors, and everything ran fine. Now, if I were to take this out, just to show you what we were experiencing before, then you would see that it is causing some issues. And you see here, we have command execution failed. And if we scroll up, it says exception, index 11 out of bounds for length 11. That's because we don't have a 11th character. So it's giving an error because it basically cannot find that 11th character in this case. So when you're working with any sequences and you're providing the length in the condition, you must make sure that you do, the variable dot length and then add -1 for everything to work smoothly. So now this would fix that situation. And that is how you can use some for loops for this. Now that we have that, we can go ahead and try our last example of our for loops, and that is just going to be using some conditions within our for loops. So we'll do example 3, for loops and conditionals. All right, so first we're going to, let's say we're going to create a number. So we'll say int number equals 20. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a for loop. And we're just going to use the for loop to specify how many times it needs to run. And take note here that I am using the same initial variable as our first for loop in this. So I'm using I again, and you can completely do that. There's no issue with that because these variables only exist within that loop. So int I, how we currently have it in our code, is only going to exist and be attached to our actual loop. It does not impact anything else. So we can reuse it in this way. So now I'm going to say while I is um, less than, let's say, less than or equal to 5, and then I plus plus to update our loop. And we're going to add our braces. All right. All right. So then we go inside and we start putting in some conditionals. So here you see that we have I is equal to 0. And while I is less than or equal to 5, we want to do this. So currently our number is 20, right? So what we could do is say if I is equal to number, then we want to say, forgot my print statement, system.out.print line, and we're going to say these numbers are equal. All right, and in it in our semicolon. Then let's say we want to do an else if to say if it's not equal. So else if I is not equal to number, then we want to do this. So we'll say again, system.out.print line, the numbers are not equal. All right. So now you see we have a for loop. The for loop is basically going to run for a set number of times based on our condition. And then every time it runs, it's basically going to do some sort of check. Now, being that this is the end of our for loop here, we can add more values here. So what we could do is we could say, for example, number is going to equal number minus 5, for example. Oops. And again, this is still in our loop, so it's basically going to subtract a value each time from number. So if we go ahead and run this, and again, I'm going to copy and paste this to go between my for loops so I'm not impacting my output and I can clearly see them. And we'll go ahead and run that. All right. And you see each time it did that, it said the numbers are not equal. Okay. So that is something we have to keep in mind. So when you're trying to troubleshoot things to see why it's doing that, you can easily just add another print statement to check your values and then delete it later. So this is just a little tip, not that you would do this in a real setting, but this is for troubleshooting purposes. So you can say number here, and that will allow you to kind of check to see what the number is holding each time the loop runs. So when we run it, then you see here, it basically says the numbers are not equal. It's 15. The numbers are not equal. Now it's 10. Now it's 5. Now it's 0. Now it's -5. And now it's -10. So you see, technically, our value of number is changing each time. But because we are telling our condition to run based off of a preset number of times, which is 5, we're basically not telling it to do anything unless our I is going to equal that number, which it never will because each time we are going through, our value of I is changing. And how do we know this? We can add a print statement, like I said, to troubleshoot it. So here we can say we're going to change this number, we're going to change this to I. So here you could say value of I And we're going to go ahead and plus, and then we'll say here value of number. And we're going to add that there. And this way, now we can kind of get a better idea of how these two variables are working in our loop. So to run that again, here we have our output. So you see here, it's telling us our value of I starts off at 0 because that's what we established in our for loop here. It says we're starting at 0. And it's going to keep running until our I is equal to 5. Which, if we come down here, we see it ran until I was equal to 5. And it changed our value of I each time by adding 1 to it, which is our update. So basically, our for loop is running perfectly. Everything is happening as it should. Now, the next part was we were checking to see if the numbers are equal. So we're checking to see if our value of I is ever going to equal number. And in this case, if we take a look, I started at 0, but the number was 15. Then I went to 1, but the number was 10. Then I went to 2, and then the number was 5. Then so on and so forth. So technically, the numbers never were equal. And that is why our only output that we have in this case was the numbers are not equal. Now again, you can modify this to make it a point where the numbers will be equal, but this is just to kind of show you the different ways that for loops and conditionals can work together. So overall, that is a good basic starting point for your for loops. These are your simple basic version of a for loop. Yes, there are other ways to write a for loop. However, I didn't want to provide you with multiple ways and provide any more confusion. So, of course, I would always recommend you continuing to deep dive and research for loops a little further to get to the information that I did not provide, as this is technically more so of a intro based class just to cover the basics and allow you to get a good foundation on these topics. So overall, I'll stop right here for our for loops. We pretty much covered the concept of the use cases of our for loops, how to create them, and also combining them with other concepts we have already learned. So hopefully you found this pretty cool. At first, it is going to take a little bit more time to catch up to fully understand how this process works. So please take your time with this and rewatch it if you need to. So I will end this video for our for loops, and the next video I will get into our while loops. So I'll see you in the next video.